Craving fresh, made-from-scratch Mexican food that actually tastes homemade? Cafe Rio's got you covered. Every tortilla is hand-rolled, every sauce is slow-simmered, and every bite is bursting with bold flavor. Hungry yet? Don't wait. Order now at CafeRio.com. Build your burrito, salad, or tacos exactly how you like them, and we'll have it ready hot, fresh, and fast. Whether it's lunch on the go, dinner with friends, or a full-on fiesta at home, Cafe Rio always brings the flavor and the fun. So what are you waiting for? We've got you covered. Savor the flavor and order now at CafeRio.com.
You're listening to the Utah Checkdown Podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown Podcast. I am Josh Furlong. Happy to be back with you again. I said that really weird. Again. Not Egan. Whatever. You get the point. I'm coming at you a little later than normal. Today was a bit of a busy day for me and wasn't able to get the podcast out earlier. So you're probably, if you are listening to this, listening to it the next day or a little bit later. Not during whenever. I don't know when you listen. As long as you're listening, that's all that matters, right? But no, I'm watching this right as Devin Lloyd just barely picked off Patrick Mahomes and took it 99 yards for his fourth interception of the season, third in back-to-back weeks. So he leads the NFL. Pretty phenomenal season for the former Ute. Obviously, Utah fans know very well what kind of prowess he has in terms of picking off the ball and all that kind of stuff. So pretty cool for the former Utah player who most likely will get paid pretty handsomely based on the way that this season is going. So anyways, yeah, coming at you late tonight, coming off of a bye week. Last week was a little bit busier than I was expecting as well, hence not being able to do another podcast, but I'm sure you're living. You don't have to listen to me that much. So we're going to give you an update on everything that took place this last week and kind of what's going on and kind of a little refresh or restart, maybe not restart, but refresh of the season and kind of the mentality. So we'll talk some game time announcement, AP Top 25 updates like we have been, and then a recap of the bye week and what's going on there, obviously. So before we do that, let me tell you about our partners. Craving fresh, made-from-scratch Mexican food that actually tastes homemade? Cafe Rio's got you covered. Every tortilla is hand-rolled, every sauce is slow-simmered, and every bite is bursting with bold flavor. Hungry yet? Don't wait. Order now at CafeRio.com. Build your burrito, salad, or tacos exactly how you like them, and we'll have it ready, hot, fresh, and fast. We've got you covered. Savor the flavor and order now at CafeRio.com. All right, we're going to start with an important game time announcement. Maybe they're all important for you. For me, they are, simply because that's how I dictate my life, and it's pretty important to know where I'm going to be and what time. So, it's important for me, but I know this is also important for the fans. And given that this next game is going to be against the Cougars in LaVell Edwards Stadium, there's going to be a lot of interest in this one. Obviously, the Big 12 hasn't been putting this at the last game of the season. I think there's some strategy to it. I talked to Brett Yormark early before Utah joined the Big 12 officially, and there was some conversations about trying to get them in a prime spot, and who knows if this truly is that time, but you're not battling with a lot of the SEC rivalries or Big Ten rivalries or anything that way, and so I think it's actually a pretty solid opportunity for Utah, and they get a great viewing window. So the game will be kicked off at, it'll be kicked off at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. That game will be on Fox. So another game on Fox for Utah this year. This will be the fourth game on Fox. So you obviously started the season with UCLA. You have the Texas Tech game. You have West Virginia, and now you've got the BYU game. So 4 of the 7 games up until this point that have been announced, technically 8 games have been announced because the Kansas game has been announced for either ESPN or ABC. But 4 of those games are on Fox. You're getting broadcast television. People are able to see this. This is a great viewing window because the East Coast is going to be able to still be relatively up. And, you get a nation watching a heated rivalry that should be pretty entertaining. and should be fun to watch. So good opportunity for both of these programs to be there. Utah, obviously, if they can take care of business, this sets it sets them up in a great spot for them to be able to really make some noise and move forward. So going into that, I want to talk about the AP Top 25 because it's weird. I feel like there's been a lot of focus on this poll every week this year, a lot more than there has in years past. And that's not to say that people aren't frustrated by it or that there hasn't been complaints about it. It's one of those that it just seems to be chaotic. And I think, quite honestly, the reason it feels chaotic is because of the nature of what college football is now. You don't have a lot of these, we'll call them dynasty teams, or these teams where you go into the season and you feel like it's theirs to lose, right? I think there has been teams that are clearly at the upper echelon, and I would argue right now there's 3 teams with Ohio State, Oregon, and Miami. You could maybe include some other teams that could be somewhat in that range, but I think right now, as it stands, those are the 3 teams that are kind of the favorite to win a title. But I think you're getting a much more diluted look into college football, and so there's a lot more chaos. And this weekend clearly showed that there was chaos with UCLA beating Penn State and Florida beating Texas, and you can even look in the Big 12 where Cincinnati beat Iowa State. There's a lot of different things that are going on, and it feels like there's much more parity in college football than there ever has been. I still think that there is clearly a divide in a lot of these upper echelon teams, but I don't know that there is these dominant teams. I mean, like you look at like Georgia, they clearly are one of the best teams in the country each year for the last decade, and even they are struggling to maintain that spot. Maybe Alabama is rising to that level again, and you're starting to see them kind of acquiesce that power again. But it's a little different, and so I think there's been a lot more attention on the AP Top 25 this year solely because of maybe not quite parity, but a little bit more toward that, where teams are moving in and out a lot. There's a lot more criticism based on how a team stacks up. I've talked about this before about looking at preseason rankings. We're now, a good 6-7 weeks in. Dang it, I didn't mean to do that. Anybody that has kids, I apologize for that. But we're a few weeks into the season now, and the whole 6-7 thing has got to stop. I need my children to be done. Anyways, this is the time where preseason rankings literally mean nothing. And so, for example, my preseason number 1 team was Penn State. And the reason I had them number 1 is solely because they bring back a majority of their roster. They bring in a lot of talent. They got a new, coordinators that should do well, still up from Ohio State. Everything was building toward them being kind of this top team and making that run this year. And clearly that hasn't been the case. Even their stronghold of defense generally hasn't stood up to time, or to the test. And so it's been interesting, right? And so this season has just kind of been chaotic, and so you're seeing a lot of updates and all that. So that's a lot of talk about that. I know you don't really care. But looking at kind of how the Big 12 is shaping up right now, you've got number 9 Texas Tech. They move up 2 spots after a win last week, and it was pretty convincing over Houston. The score was, I wouldn't call it close, but I wouldn't call it quite as a blowout either, but it felt much more like a blowout considering that Texas Tech really was in control the whole time. And I think there's a clear path there where the Red Raiders are the favorite. And I think that is pretty well documented and is holding up as it stands. Now, there's going to be a little bit more of tests down the line, but this is a team that has done really well, and barring some adversity or injuries or some different things, this is a team that looks great. So nothing there. BYU moves up to number 18. They jump up 5 spots after beating West Virginia. I'll get back to that in a second because that's a little interesting. And then Arizona State is at number 21. They also move up 4 spots on a bye week. And then Iowa State drops 8 spots to number 22 after losing their first game of the season to Cincinnati. So really, really kind of interesting situation here. And I kind of want to talk about that. This is where the I wouldn't even call it frustration, but I think the imperfection of the AP poll kind of shows. And as I've mentioned, as a voter, I understand this. My balloting isn't perfect, and there's different things that you can pick apart on my ballot, and it's absolutely correct, right? Like there's a lot of things that you can fight on that. So. The interesting thing here, though, is so Utah's on a bye week, and they dropped 2 spots in the receiving vote section. So they were at 27 unofficially. They dropped down to 29, despite having more votes cast for them. But it's just the nature of a lot more consolidation of these teams, teams kind of being voted on in different ways. And so it looks like they moved down. In reality, they got a bump, but you had other teams dropping. So, for example, Texas and Penn State both dropped out of the rankings after being, in the top 10-ish, or they were both in the top 10, excuse me. And, you kind of move those things around. You're still going to have people that are voting for them for whatever reason. I did not, for the record. And so you're getting a shift there, right, where some teams are jumping Utah solely because of what they've done in 1 week. There's a lot of reactions for 1 week. And you're getting more into the season where the whole totality of the resume should be factored in. But at the same time, you're getting people that get really reactionary to a game, let's say like Cincinnati, right? I'm not saying Cincinnati isn't deserving. I actually had Cincinnati in my top 25. So that's not one that I would say is too reactionary because they've lost 1 game. They look good. They beat Iowa State, that kind of stuff. So like there's different things there. The thing here that's interesting is Utah, they don't really move on a bye week, which is typical, right? That's how it goes. But you have a similar situation with Arizona State, who moves up 4 spots on a bye week, and nothing necessarily changed for them. There wasn't anything on their resume that necessarily was improved. If anything, Utah's improved. And I'm not saying that because I'm a Utah beat writer or that I'm trying to prop up Utah. I think this is just where you're kind of seeing some of the issues with it, where once you're included in the club, it's much easier to move up because other teams are dropping. And there's not really a lot of consistency of re-ranking. It's a lot of lazy effort to just say, oh, well, they were 24 and I had to drop 3 teams out, so they naturally they move up 3 spots or 4 spots or whatever it may be. I think that's the lazy side of it, and it would be real easy for me to go do that each week, right? And say, okay, this is how I've ranked my teams, and I can just move them up, and I don't have to really give a ton of thought into it. More than ever, I've been trying to be a little bit more to the level where I try to re-rank the teams each week. Now, it's not a full re-ranking. I could go in there and fully re-rank them. So there's still some of what I've already done. But at the same time, if a team still won and didn't look good or they're trending in the wrong direction, I have no problem dropping them. So I'm not saying my system is the great way, right? Like I've gone on too long with this, but it's an interesting situation that way on how it works. By all accounts, UCLA beating Penn State helps Utah's resume. Texas Tech continually winning and being in a top 10 helps Utah's resume. And Utah beating West Virginia by more than BYU beat West Virginia should prop up Utah, but it in some ways didn't. And so you can kind of see how that becomes a struggle. Once again, Utah gained more support in the poll, but it just wasn't enough based on how it goes. So interesting nonetheless. I say all that more as context than anything. I know that gives some people frustrations. Other people I saw on Twitter this week, especially really happy that Utah wasn't ranked because they feel like Utah does better as an underdog. You can't have it both ways, right? You can't have it be where you want Utah to be this underdog, but then be the top dog at the same time, right? Like obviously Utah has to prove it, and they've got to show that they can get there and do it in the right timing. Obviously beating a team like Texas Tech in the national spotlight would be ideal. But I think if you really truly want this Utah team to have as much success as possible, why are you worrying about where they're ranked in terms of letting them be an underdog? This team is competitive. They don't care about the rankings. I think it gives you a little boost if you feel like you're in the rankings. But at the same time, if players are looking at their rankings to dictate how they play on Saturday, it's not going to be a successful season anyway. So I don't know that it really matters if Utah's ranked or not, in the sense of saying, okay, Utah's the underdog. They're the underdog in the sense that they're playing the defending champions, and they've got to prove that they're better than them, right? They've got to prove that they're a better team than just beating up on these other teams that are lower in the conference, whether it be West Virginia or somebody else. You've got to be able to show that you can be a dominant team. And so, it's an interesting situation, but it is what it is. So I spent long enough on that. I apologize. I know you don't listen to this for the AP Top 25, but I feel like I do provide a unique perspective simply because I am the lone voter in the state. And so I try to give my perspective of that. Feel free to hit me up if you're like, no, stop dragging on about AP Top 25 stuff. In years past, I haven't talked about it as much, but like I said, I think this year there's been a lot more interest in it. So, interesting nonetheless. Today was the first time we got to hear from Kyle Whittingham in a week. So we got the West Virginia game. Obviously, there was a lot of injuries in that game, and, we were kind of left without any official information on where things went. And so this was the first time we got a chance to talk to Kyle about that, and he did provide an update, though it's still kind of the Kyle Whittingham update. But he said none of those injuries were season-ending, and so going forward, you'll just check the availability report. That'll tell you the status. Fortunately, not season-ending, but we'll see who we have available this week and who we have out at an extended time. So good news for all those players, right? Like, you get a great opportunity where you don't have season-ending injuries, but we still don't know to the extent of what that means, right? Nate Ritchie is the guy that I think everybody's thinking about. He leaves the field with a full, brace on his leg. He's on crutches. That generally indicates, a pretty serious injury. A lot of times the guys that are wearing that, it's an ACL injury. I know some of this is precautionary too. So, right, like, that's not a predictor of what an injury is, but that has been really kind of what kind of showcases that. And so I think there's a lot of people that expected Nate Ritchie to be out, myself included. But it sounds like everything, is not season ending. To that effect, though, how long is he going to be out, and really can he get back into where he needs to be back on the field remains to be another question. So don't count on Ritchie for a while. That could be a week, that could be 6 weeks. I don't know. I think that's really up to what his timeline is, and unfortunately we won't know what the extent of that injury is to really know. So in his absence, we talked about Nate Tillman stepping up in that West Virginia game and being able to be the guy that kind of fills that role, right? He's a young kid, freshman. He did well enough in the West Virginia game to kind of learn some things, get that, like I said last week, teach tape, to put it out there and help him understand, if he is called upon, this is going to be a much more difficult test against Arizona State. But you've got to throw these guys in there eventually, right? You've got to be able to see how they do and what they can do. So I think he'll be kind of the lead guy that lines up next to Teo Johnson to help that. But Kyle also mentioned Jackson Benny filling in. Now, if you remember, Jackson Benny was another player that was hurt in that West Virginia game. The mere fact that he says his name indicates that, this isn't long-term. And as I mentioned last week, it wasn't expected to be long-term. It sounded like he could have played the rest of the game if Utah needed him, but there was no need to, simply because they were destroying West Virginia, and no need to risk that. You had a bye week to help heal that. And so if he's able to fill in at safety, that's obviously another somewhat proven body that can get in there. He's obviously been really effective this year, still has a lot to learn, but has done really well. And then he threw out a name of Rock Caldwell. So this is a corner transferred into Utah in the offseason, bigger body guy that they feel like that they can put in there to help with that if they need to. So that would be interesting as well. So we'll see what happens. I think as long as Nate Tillman does his job there, they're going to stick with him. That would be kind of the preference, so that you don't have to move Jackson around. You can put Jackson in the nickel still keep Smith Snowden out on the outside, put him in star coverage on Jordan Tyson or whatever that may be. and be able to have that extra body to help you. So curious to see how that goes. And then the last person that was banged up was Dallas Vakalahi. He's obviously been dealing with some injuries throughout the season, and so it's just probably another one of those things where we'll see if he can go. The bye week absolutely helped that, where Utah was able to rest up and do what they need to. So that's the injury update. Good news for Utah. I think in years past, the last two specifically, these types of updates clearly didn't trend well for Utah, and you had Nate Ritchie, Jackson Benny, and Dallas Vakalahi all out, right? Like that's what it would have been. And so I think it's a different setting, and I think, it's a great opportunity for Utah to potentially have these guys back. So there's that. Now, before we continue, let me tell you about our other partners, Canyon View Credit Union. At Canyon View Credit Union, it's on the house. Close a mortgage and get a free appraisal up to $600. To learn more details or apply, visit canyonviewcu.com. All right, let's jump into some of the other stuff that Whittingham talked about this week. Talking about the Rice-Eccles Stadium environment. There's a couple things that I want to talk here. First is Whittingham said a night game at Rice-Eccles is one of the best environments in the country. Obviously, this is a statement that resonates with Utah fans. They've been, you as a fan, have been clamoring for a night game all season, the last couple seasons. You want to show out. And so I think, Utah's really trying to embrace this opportunity, really trying to showcase what they can do at nighttime in a strong environment that just has a little bit extra juice. It's clear that that's the case. And, Utah, doesn't mean that they can win or that they will win, but they generally show out in the night. And, it's just a different vibe. So will be interesting this week. The game obviously kicks off in the 8 o'clock hour, and so it's going to be a late one. But I think there's a lot of anticipation for this to be a night game, right? And I think they're excited. The team all around is excited for that. Now, the other thing here is, so Kyle Whittingham was asked about the 0-5 record at Rice-Eccles Stadium in Big 12 games. This is obviously just the second season that Utah is in the Big 12. Last year, obviously, there's a lot of nuances to that in terms of how Utah played. And so the traditional home standing of Rice-Eccles Stadium did not live up to its standard last year. And so Kyle was asked about that, and he gave, I knowing Kyle Whittingham and talking with him over the last few years, it was more tongue-in-cheek in my opinion. But he says, that sucks. I wasn't aware of that. I probably should have been. And he also adds about kind of, does it add any extra motivation? He says it hadn't. It might now. I didn't realize that. That's a trend we hope to break this week. How about that? Now, look, I tweeted it today as part of the natural tweets that I put out there for these things. And there's a lot of people misunderstanding how this is, that they really believe that Kyle did not know that Utah was in this situation. Now, maybe he didn't know the exact record, but I guarantee you he knows exactly what's happened the last few years, right? Kyle Whittingham is one of those guys that obsesses over the details, and whether that be stats or whether that be records, he's all over that. And so a lot of the times he'll play along with the media. He gave a little joking answer with PK today asking about tackling. He has fun with it and he'll see it through. But the guy knows. I guarantee you he knows that this is the situation. I don't think that they put extra pressure on themselves to win. They just genuinely want to win, and they want to be able to defend their home territory, right? Like, that's a natural thing. And, I don't think there's anything more to that, right? Like, Kyle Whittingham isn't sitting here trying to figure out, what their record is or how things go. So don't worry about that. It's not one of those things that is crazy, but you got, nothing that is getting past him. We'll say that. And the biggest question that I think many people have had and have raised to me, and this is a question that I asked on behalf of Justin. Many people may know who Justin is, who's there as kind of a He's not a media member, but he's there to kind of ask Kyle questions, to one of Kyle's friends. And the question was about Byrd Ficklin. Byrd obviously has had I don't know if I'd go ahead and say a standout year, right? It's been limited, but I think in the time that we have seen him it has been pretty solid. And so there's been questions on, is he actually QB2? Is Byrd, going to redshirt? He's at that 4 games. That's where he's played. Is there any desire to redshirt them? And look, the reality is there's not. The red shirts don't really matter anymore. The NCAA is expected to move to 5 full seasons of eligibility where there's not really a red shirt anyway. And so even if you have a red shirt and you didn't play, it's going to mean nothing in the end because you've got essentially 5 seasons to play. So red shirts aren't going to mean much anymore. If you have a guy that is playing well, why not put him out there, right? And you're going to put him out there to get him some test minutes and to be able to make sure that you can get some good reps so that, if Devin decides to leave this year or leaves in 2 years, you've got a guy that is proven. He may not be proven to the level of being a full-time starter yet, but at least you're getting him introduced into what it can be. And a lot of those times are garbage minutes, I get, but at the same time, you're getting him introduced into Division I football. And, last year when Isaac Wilson started, I went and did a whole research episode on freshman QBs talking about kind of what that is. And there's a drastic improvement in redshirt freshmen as opposed to true freshmen when they can just get a few more reps, right? If you've got somebody that can just get in there and have a few reps throughout a season, redshirt that season, and then go through a whole new, then start as a redshirt freshman, it's such a big difference for that player. So this clearly won't be a redshirt season for him. So he'll be a sophomore next year. That's their intent. Kyle Whittingham didn't necessarily say that he is QB2, but he didn't say no either. He just mentioned how good he's been, and they're grateful to be able to have him in a position where he can show out. He has done really well. He loves his poise and what he's able to do, and so there's no real desire to redshirt him. Ergo, he's going to continue to be kind of this backup quarterback until he's not, right? And that he's not situation to me, I don't know is going to come, right? Like here's where I stand with this. If Devin Dampier were to go out for a game due to injury or he can't play or whatever that may have you, my belief now is that Byrd Ficklin would be QB2. They run similar offenses. They do a lot of they have similarities in kind of their play style. And so you're going to have a guy that is going to fit that. Now, if this is long-term, right? Like if Devin is out for the rest of the season, there's a real possibility that Isaac Wilson could be that guy, right? You go with somebody that has a little bit more proven tape. He's been in there, and I can already hear some people, yelling that, it wasn't a good experience last year. And yes, a lot of that was put on him that was undeserved and was tough. But, it's a really interesting situation. At the end of the day, I think Byrd Ficklin is your unofficial 2. And, as long as Devin Dampier stays healthy, it doesn't really matter, right? And if you can get him in the games when it matters, or not matters, but when you can get him in the games where he can do what he needs to kind of prove him, that's a great opportunity. So you can be upset about red shirts. You can be upset that he hasn't officially named a QB2. At this point, Byrd is that guy. And, you're doing really well with him. So you can't be too upset with that. And I think it's a great position for Utah because you've got a guy that is showing promise. As we've learned around the league, just because you're showing promise in garbage minutes doesn't mean that it's going to guarantee you have success when you're actually the starter, a.k.a. Arch Manning. There's a lot more pressure on him than there is Byrd Ficklin. But you can see the optimism, right? And you can see a path where he is a strong contender for the starting job whenever Devin decides to leave. So we'll leave it at that. Couple more things here. Just kind of a team evaluation at the somewhat halfway point on the season. Kyle Whittingham, reflected on it a little bit, gave little statements on each position group and kind of how they've done. First off, he kind of mentioned the tackling against West Virginia wasn't as bad as he thought. Utah only missed 10 tackles, but it was, things that they felt like they could correct. Previous games, it's been much higher, and it hasn't been great, but they've made a big emphasis to try to push them and get them in right positioning to essentially tackle correctly. So I think, he's seeing improvement there. What that means remains to be seen. Utah obviously has to go against an Arizona State team that it can be pretty tough with Sam Leavitt, who is a mobile quarterback who, is going to make guys miss. That's going to happen. You're going to see Utah players miss, and if they don't, all the more power to them, and Utah probably wins if they can 100% contain. You're also having a dynamic wide receiver who's going to be a guy that is tough. And so it's just a matter of positioning and getting there. But this has been a season-long effort to make sure that they're there. And I think Utah feels like they've turned a corner, but that remains to be seen, right? We'll see that. So there's good evaluation. They feel confident about where they're at and everything there. Moving on, we'll go to each kind of positioning. Offensive line, he feels like they've played well. I think that's an understatement. I think this offensive line has been pretty phenomenal. There's some down moments in the Texas Tech game, but by and large, it really hasn't been that bad, and they've been able to hold up everything that they need to give Devin Dampier what he needs to in the backfield and do his job, right? That has also translated to the running backs who have been able to be effective. As you may remember, as I go through these stats, we look at line yards and how well they've been able to produce. Utah's one of the best in the country at creating line yards, and so giving their running backs already a jumping off point. And then a guy like Wayshawn Parker especially, is averaging a ton of yards and kind of going the extra distance to do well. So, all in all, the offense has been pretty solid. You've got tight ends that have been quote unquote productive. Even the receivers, Kyle says they're making progress with that game, and they feel like they're making the necessary moves to do that. You saw against West Virginia that they threw for 290 yards. That's a big indication of where Utah's hoping to try to go, right? West Virginia's defense is not the best in the Big 12, but it's also not the worst. And the fact that they were able to go for 290 yards shows kind of the emphasis of where they can be. It's going to be much harder against some teams, but it's also going to be easier against other teams. So if they can continue to sprinkle it in, I think it's really just kind of seeing how the game develops. That's very much so how Jason Beck is operating this offense, and it's been effective. There's some graphics that I tweeted out that kind of show how effective Utah's been in their success rate and kind of where they stack up amongst the rest of the teams in the nation, and Utah's one of the best. So, you've got to be happy with what this offense is doing. This may not mean that Utah wins the Big 12, and that's okay, right? Like, as fans, you've got to be taking the incremental steps, and it's far less incremental in the sense of how it used to be, where each year was a building year. You keep stacking classes. You obviously want that timeline has shortened simply because of the transfer portal and different things that way, but Utah doesn't necessarily have to win the Big 12 title to have success this year. I think they can be in the hunt and still consider this a successful season, especially given where Utah was at with their offense last year. I think the biggest knock coming into this season was that Kyle Whittingham was going to hamper this offense, that it was going to be his stamp on it, and Jason Beck wasn't going to be able to do it. He was just a dummy in the sense of a dummy, not like an idiot, right? Like just a middleman, the figurehead, so to speak, of running the offense, and it was Kyle calling the plays through him. No, you're seeing the effect of Jason Beck, right? You saw what he did at New Mexico, where he took a team and took them all the way to the tops of the league. You're now seeing that with Jason Beck and Devin Dampier running this offense. The two of them combined, it's not one or the other, but at the same time, it's Jason identifying his talent and scheming towards it. It has meant a whole world for this Utah team. Last year, you were so used, I don't know if they were used to, but you saw so much an offense that just could not move the ball. And now you've got an offense that is performing at an incredibly high rate. And so the offensive line, the running backs, the tight ends, even the wide receivers, they've all been effective in how they've been able to do it. And so there's not really a bad grade that can be assessed to it, right? There's nitpicking stuff, right? Instead of running for 300 yards, you need to sprinkle in a little bit more passing. You saw against Texas Tech, you needed a little bit more of that. Granted, some of that was Devin Dampier being injured and not being able to go fully against the team in practice and doing all that. And so that game's a little nuanced. It's never going to change, right? Utah lost to Texas Tech. They've always lost to Texas Tech in that regard. And, get over it. If you go through the rest of the season with one loss, who cares, right? Texas Tech, who? But I think you've got to focus on these things where Utah is having an effective year. And I was talking to somebody earlier today where it feels like this season is kind of boring in the sense that there's not drama, right? The last few years we've had drama and it's been pretty chaotic in kind of how things have gone. And so it just felt really difficult to try to find consistency, but at the same time, there was a ton of storylines because there were so many different things going on, and you didn't know what was happening, there was not a lot of consistency, and so there was a lot of storylines to be able to talk about. Right now, things are going, I wouldn't say so well, but things are going well that it just feels kind of like ho-hum, like you're going down and things are being effective. That's a good thing, right? I think the fact that you don't have that drama and the fact that you have to nitpick kind of the receivers, and don't get me wrong, there's a lot to talk about with the receivers. I asked Devin Dampier today about kind of his connection with Tobias Merriweather and not being able to get him the ball, and he says, I'm still looking for, this is what he told him. He says, I'm still looking for you. You're a heck of a player. The way the offense rolls is the way the offense rolls, but he's doing a great job carrying himself. He knows the ball is going to find him at some point, and I'm happy the way he's carrying himself. So I don't think there's any loss between these two. Obviously, Merriweather would love to be able to have the ball. Devin would love to get him the ball. But it's also not at the detriment of the offense, if that makes sense. You've got Ryan Davis, you've got Dallin Bentley, you've got J.J. Buchanan, who have been great so far for Utah. Can it always be them? No. I think you still have to develop more pass catchers and be able to make sure that you can spread that ball around. But Utah's finding ways to get the ball to multiple people, whether that be in the run game, the passing game, whatever that may be. So in terms of a team evaluation of where Utah's at, things have been a success, right? Like everything is going well the way that Utah wants it to with the offense. That has a major caveat, though. Outside of Texas Tech, and we've talked about Texas Tech and the way that game went, Utah hasn't fully been tested, right? And some of that is just how good this offense has been, right? You're destroying bad teams, which shows what you can do. But as you saw against Penn State with UCLA, it's not that UCLA didn't have talented players. They just didn't have the right personnel fitting and gelling at the right time, right? That's not to say that Utah just, rolled through and everything was great. They were playing at a level that they were trying to do their best in that beginning of the season. And it's going to click to different levels, and I don't want to use that game as a big measuring stick. But at the same time, Utah is doing what they need to against lesser opponents. And if that's what you're doing, that generally indicates that you're on an upward trajectory in terms of kind of how this program is moving, right? On the defensive side, Kyle says the D-line has been, quote, solid. John Henry Daly has been, quote, a big plus for us. That's obvious to see, right? Like he's a guy that has come in there and been I wouldn't even call him a big surprise, but he's been a guy that, there was a lot of conversations about some other players that maybe could have been, Utah's mayor of Sac Lake City. John Henry Daly has been a really solid addition to this roster, and it isn't until this year where you're kind of really realizing how talented he can be. And so I think, him solidifying the other side of the line opposite of Logan Fano has really been a big plus, because if you put a lot of attention on John Henry Daly, you've got Logan Fano on the other side who's able to do a lot of tremendous things as well. So it's been a great opportunity there for Utah. Their defensive tackles, despite losing Dallas Vakalahi, despite losing Aliki Vamahi, they've been able to continually find ways to be effective, right? Whether it be through freshmen, whether it be through Jonah Leia, whether it be through a bunch of different guys that they've been able to utilize. That defensive line coming into the season it wasn't a weakness by any means, but it was one that had a lot more questions. And I think in this first few games of the season, they've definitely passed that test. There's things that they can still improve on, right? Like, you're never going to be perfect. But at the same time, compared to what some of the questions there were for this unit, this has become a great asset for Utah. Behind them is the linebackers, which, going into the season, you would say that this is the best unit on the team in terms of the defense. You bring back 3 proven guys. You've got a lot of opportunity there to be able to have playmakers who are instinctual, who are, they hit hard, they've done well. And Kyle says that they've been outstanding. He says Lander Barton, who obviously is kind of the leader of that room, is playing his best football. And there's no disagreeing to that. I think he's been a phenomenal asset to that defense this year. He doesn't look like last year where he was still kind of shaking the rust off of his injury. This is a guy that is playing really well. He's been instinctual. They've done well. Jonathan Hall has really stepped up in his role. There's still things that he has to learn, and there's sometimes he's out of position, and that's where you get some of these missed tackles. But by and large, this is a group that has been pretty solid. And then the secondary, Kyle, gave an interesting comment, and I don't think he's wrong, but he says the secondary hasn't really been tested. He says it'll come, and it will, this week in particular, but he feels like that they haven't fully been tested. And, I can already hear somebody saying, oh, the Texas Tech game, they were tested. And they were, but for the most part, they didn't have to really do a ton of work. Now, that could be because they were in coverage and doing their job. That could be that there wasn't a lot of opportunities thrown their way. And with that said, there's been other games, let's say Wyoming or Cal Poly, where, receivers got behind them and the quarterback just missed them. So it's a little bit of both, right? I would say that yes, they haven't fully been tested and it's going to get more challenging, but I would say it still hasn't been the most polished unit on the team. So if there's one area on the defensive side of the ball that still has maybe not a concern, but is still in need of proving, it's probably the secondary, right? I think the coverages have been decently well. It hasn't been terrible, but at the same time, how will that be when you have different teams that are going to be much tougher? Jordan Tyson this week is going to be a tough test, right? But at the same time, he's one player. This isn't like Utah going up against the USCs of the world where you had 3-4 guys that you could throw to on any given play and that they could make a bunch of runs, right? This is a completely different team going in where you can play some star coverage, or you can have different things where you can kind of limit what Tyson does or any of the other wide receivers. It's not that he's the only guy, but he is clearly like one of the best in the league. If they can limit him, that's a big win for this team. And I think as the season goes on, Utah's secondary always picks up steam, right? There's always something about it that they need to learn and work through, whether it be season-ending injuries in years past or youth. This year's a little bit more youth / trying to get guys coming in from the portal. They continually pick up steam. And I'm really fascinated to see how Utah answers or not out of the bye week, right? Is this an opportunity for them to take that next step? Did they get the right reps? Did they do what they need to be able to grow? Or is this something where you regress? Do you kind of get lackadaisical? Like, where is this going to be? And so for me, of all the units that I'm looking at, this is still kind of the area where I think I have questions. This week will obviously be a big test. Against BYU, Bear Bachmeier is still not proven to be kind of like this earth-shattering passer, but that's because they haven't fully made him that way. And we'll get into both of these games in the coming weeks, but they've got receivers, especially at BYU. They've got a multitude of receivers that they can get the ball to. And if he can get the ball to them, that it's going to be a great opportunity to test this secondary. So really fascinated to kind of see how these two go, what it looks like, how things are, and kind of what happens there. So at the end of the day, Utah obviously needs to prove that they can win in these big games, and you get two of them immediately right off the bat with Arizona State and BYU, both ranked teams. You pick up wins in both of those. That puts Utah well on their way to kind of their goals. I don't want to put too much pressure on this game, but I think this is one of those where, I called the West Virginia game an inflection point in terms of being able to kind of show what mentality they're going to have for the season, and clearly they proved that, right? They didn't look like they were coming off of a loss. They looked really strong. They looked confident, and everything worked well. Now, what do you do when you go up against these teams? Traditionally, Utah's had some good battles with Arizona State, but they've generally done well against them. And, we'll see what that means. This is a completely different team. Kenny Dillingham is a phenomenal coach. We'll talk about him a little later in this week as we preview them. But Kenny Dillingham has 100% tried to model his program after Utah in terms of the culture and kind of the consistency in what they do, and has developed a little bit of a friendship with Kyle Whittingham. These two talk quite a bit on how to build a program. And so really fascinated with this. This is a tough test for both of these teams, but this is really where it comes down to, is Utah for real? We've talked about, Utah being good, but it's been against bad opponents. And so now is really the time where we get to see if Utah is truly good, or, if they're just kind of middling in the Big 12. So we'll see that. Lastly, we'll talk about what Kyle Whittingham said about how he views the Big 12. He said the conference runs through Texas Tech. That's not earth-shattering. This isn't something that, is a hot take by any means. It's pretty clear that Texas Tech is in a league of its own right now. That's not to say that they're going to remain undefeated or that teams can't get them. I still think that they're not... I don't want to even say that they're not a finished product or a complete product, because I think they are. I just think there are some weaknesses, most notably with Baron Morton. I don't trust him fully as a quarterback. You saw that against Utah. They minimized a lot of what he was able to do, and that's not to say that he wasn't good at moments, but he's not some stellar quarterback. And if they had, if you were to put Sam Leavitt in that offense, quite honestly, I don't know how you stop Texas Tech. I think they would be a phenomenal offense, and there's not much you could do. That, to me, is kind of the hesitations where you can potentially beat Texas Tech. With that said, though, their defense is really solid. They're a tough team, right? So whether they lose this year or not remains to be seen. But it seems like the conference will run through Texas Tech, like Kyle Whittingham said. Outside of that, he believes that there's about 4 to 6 teams in contention for the title. I think that's pretty accurate. You look at it right now, you've got those 4 ranked teams. You've got Texas Tech, you've got BYU, you've got Arizona State, you've got Iowa State. I would assume that he thinks that they are a contender. I would, as a coach, you would hope that he thinks that they're a contender. And so, you put them in there. And I think he's looking at Cincinnati right now. That would be 6. That's where he would go. I think you've seen a little bit of a misstep with TCU recently. They haven't seemed to have that same edge that they started out with. I kind of put them in a top-ish tier early on, but they just, for whatever reason, haven't been able to really put a stamp on that. Kansas has their up and downs. Kansas State is just kind of a mess. Trying to think of some other teams there. That 4 to 6 is probably an accurate statement. Maybe you could throw a 7th team in there, but I think at that point you start diluting it, and it gets to be a challenge. So really fascinated to kind of see how this conference goes. This last half of the season is going to be a real test for all of these teams. You get a lot of these teams that are going to face each other. Utah obviously has to go through Arizona State. They've got to go through BYU. You get Cincinnati that is now looking really good, and that becomes a tough test. You still get Kansas and Kansas State, but what do they mean, here? Colorado, they have moments where they look really solid, and then other moments where they just don't look like they have it put together. So this isn't by any means an easy task. BYU, for example, they finished the season, I think, with 4-ish ranked teams. Well, not 4 ranked, because clearly they're ranked. You get what I'm saying. that level of type team, right? So you've got a really tough schedule for them. Texas Tech has probably one of the easier schedules going through without looking at it. Arizona State, I can't remember what their schedule is. But like I said, a lot of these teams are going to face each other. It's going to be a tough test, and we'll see what happens. So this will start whittling down, or it'll continue to be the 4 to 6 teams. But I think Texas Tech is definitely taking that step forward, and we'll see what happens. But I think we're starting to see a little bit more of what this conference is all about this year. I don't think it has as much parity as it did last year in terms of full parity, but I think you do definitely have more of the quote-unquote upper echelon teams that are going to fight and battle. But these next 2 weeks especially are going to really indicate kind of where these teams are. And that's kind of coincidental that Utah's also in that run, right? You've got, like I said, Arizona State, BYU. It's going to be an interesting test. So with that, that's kind of a little update on the bye week. We're going to jump into a conversation about Arizona State later this week. Once again, I'll bring a beat writer on to have a conversation about them, and we'll go from there. This is a really fascinating team, and we'll see what happens. So with that, hope you have a good day, and we'll catch you later on in this week.